Part 4 of an episode of Fiddletown. From Selected Stories by Bret Harte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Jeff Cowgill. Selected Stories by Bret Harte. An episode of Fiddletown. Part 4. Meantime, Mr. Jack Prince, the name given on the card, and various letters and credentials submitted to the Reverend Mr. Crammer, paced the somewhat severe apartment known publicly as the reception parlor, and privately to the pupils as purgatory. His keen eyes had taken in the various rigid details, from the flat steam radiator like an enormous japanned soda cracker that heated one end of the room, to the monumental bust of Dr. Crammer that hopelessly chilled the other. From the Lord's Prayer, executed by a former writing master in such gratuitous variety of elegant calligraphic trifling as to abate considerably the serious value of the composition, to 3 views of Genoa from the Institute, which nobody ever recognized, taken on the spot by the drawing teacher. From 2 illuminated texts of Scripture in an English letter, so gratuitously and hideously remote as to chill all human interest, to a large photograph of the senior class, in which the prettiest girls were Ethiopian in complexion, and sat apparently on each other's heads and shoulders. His fingers had turned listlessly the leaves of school catalogues, the sermons of Dr. Crammer, the poems of Henry Kirke White, the lays of the Sanctuary, and lives of celebrated women. His fancy, and it was a nervously active one, had gone over the partings and greetings that must have taken place here, and wondered why the apartment had yet caught so little of the flavor of humanity. Indeed, I am afraid he had almost forgotten the object of his visit when the door opened and Carrie Tretherick stood before him. It was one of those faces he had seen the night before, prettier even than it had seemed then, and yet I think he was conscious of some disappointment, without knowing exactly why. Her abundant waving hair was of a guinea golden tint, her complexion of a peculiar flower-like delicacy, her brown eyes of the color of seaweed in deep water. It was certainly not her beauty that disappointed him. Without possessing his sensitiveness to impression, Carrie was, on her part, quite as vaguely ill at ease. She saw before her one of those men whom the sex would vaguely generalize as nice, that is to say, correct in all the superficial appointments of style, dress, manners, and features. Yet there was a decidedly unconventional quality about him. He was totally unlike anything or anybody that she could remember, and as the attributes of originality are often as apt to alarm as to attract people, she was not entirely prepossessed in his favor. "I can hardly hope," he began pleasantly, "that you remember me. It is 11 years ago, and you were a very young girl. I'm afraid I cannot even claim to have enjoyed that familiarity that might exist between a child of 6 and a young man of 21. I don't think I was fond of children. But I knew your mother very well. I was editor of the Avalanche in Fiddletown when she took you to San Francisco." "You mean my stepmother. She wasn't my mother, you know," interposed Carrie hastily. Mr. Prince looked at her curiously. "I mean your stepmother," he said gravely. "I never had the pleasure of meeting your mother." "No, mother hasn't been in California these 12 years. There was an intentional emphasizing of the title and of its distinction that began to interest coldly Prince after his first astonishment was past. "As I come from your stepmother now," he went on with a slight laugh, "I must ask you to go back for a few moments to that point. After your father's death, your mother, your stepmother, recognized the fact that your mother, the first Mrs. Tretherick, was legally and morally your guardian, and, although much against her inclination and affections, placed you again in her charge. My stepmother married again within a month after my father died and sent me home," said Carrie with great directness and the faintest toss of her head. Mr. Prince smiled so sweetly and apparently so sympathetically that Carrie began to like him. With no other notice of the interruption, he went on. "After your stepmother had performed this act of simple justice, she entered into an agreement with your mother to defray the expenses of your education until your 18th year, when you were to elect and choose which of the two should thereafter be your guardian, and with whom you would make your home. This agreement, I think, you are already aware of, and I believe knew at the time." "I was a mere child then," said Carrie. "Certainly," said Mr. Prince, with the same smile. "Still, the conditions, I think, have never been oppressive to you nor your mother, and the only time they are likely to give you the least uneasiness will be when you come to make up your mind in the choice of your guardian. That will be on your 18th birthday, the 20th, I think, of the present month." Carrie was silent. "Pray do not think that I am here to receive your decision, even if it be already made. I only wish to inform you that your stepmother, Mrs. Starbottle, will be in town tomorrow, and will pass a few days at the hotel. If it is your wish to see her before you make up your mind, she will be glad to meet you. She does not, however, wish to do anything to influence your judgment." "Does Mother know she's coming?" said Carrie hastily. "I do not know," said Prince gravely. "I only know that if you conclude to see Mrs. Starbottle, it will be with your mother's permission. Mrs. Starbottle will keep sacredly this part of the agreement, made 10 years ago. But her health is very poor, and the change and country quiet of a few days may benefit her." Mr. Prince bent his keen, bright eyes upon the young girl, and almost held his breath until she spoke again. "Mother's coming up today or tomorrow," she said, looking up. "Ah," said Mr. Prince with a sweet and languid smile. "Is Colonel Starbottle here too?" asked Carrie after a pause. "Colonel Starbottle is dead. Your stepmother is again a widow." "Dead?" repeated Carrie. "Yes," replied Mr. Prince. "Your stepmother has been singularly unfortunate in surviving her affections." Carrie did not know what he meant, and looked so. Mr. Prince smiled reassuringly. Presently, Carrie began to whimper. Mr. Prince softly stepped beside her chair. "I'm afraid," he said, with a very peculiar light in his eye, and a singular dropping of the corners of his mustache, "I'm afraid you are taking this too deeply. It will be some days before you are called upon to make a decision. Let us talk of something else. I hope you caught no cold last evening." Carrie's face shone out again in dimples. "You must have thought us so queer. It was too bad to give you so much trouble." "None whatever, I assure you. My sense of propriety," he added demurely, "which might have been outraged had I been called upon to help 3 young ladies out of a schoolroom window at night, was deeply gratified at being able to assist them in again." The doorbell rang loudly, and Mr. Prince rose. "Take your own time, and think well before you make your decision." But Carrie's ear and attention were given to the sound of voices in the hall. At the same moment the door was thrown open, and a servant announced, "Mrs. Tretherick and Mr. Robinson." The afternoon train had just shrieked out its usual indignant protest at stopping at Genoa at all, as Mr. Jack Prince entered the outskirts of the town and drove toward his hotel. He was wearied and cynical. A drive of a dozen miles through unpicturesque outlying villages, past small economic farmhouses and hideous villas that violated his fastidious taste, had, I fear, left that gentleman in a captious state of mind. He would have even avoided his taciturn landlord as he drove up to the door, but that functionary waylaid him on the steps. "There's a lady in the sitting-room waiting for you." Mr. Prince hurried upstairs and entered the room as Mrs. Starbottle flew toward him. She had changed sadly in the last 10 years. Her figure was wasted to half its size. The beautiful curves of her bust and shoulders were broken or inverted. The once full, rounded arm was shrunken in its sleeve, and the golden hoops that encircled her wan wrists almost slipped from her hands as her long, scant fingers closed convulsively around Jack's. Her cheekbones were painted that afternoon with the hectic of fever. Somewhere in the hollows of those cheeks were buried the dimples of long ago, but their graves were forgotten. Her lustrous eyes were still beautiful, though the orbits were deeper than before. Her mouth was still sweet, although the lips parted more easily over the little teeth, even in breathing, and showed more of them